comfort. What does this word bring to mind for you? At first glance, it might seem a fluffy little concept, a pleasant feeling of relaxation, a state of ease, peace of mind. Sounds nice enough, but not exactly essential to life. If we dig deeper, we find more potent senses of the word. Freedom from pain or constraint, the easing or alleviation of grief or distress. It's in these definitions that the real value of comfort emerges, the vital ability to take relief, even for a moment, from misery. Even with people we might despise, seeing a vulnerable human being in torment can stir our most powerful instincts for compassion. We feel disarmed. These instincts represent some of our most humanizing qualities, sometimes melting previous divisions, dissolving hostilities, allowing us to connect with each other in powerfully healing ways. But these same compassionate instincts can also have harmful consequences. In our attempts to comfort some people, we sometimes end up throwing others under the bus. Like when we tell our atheist son he should keep going to church to make his mother happy. When our daughter discloses her same-sex attraction and we command her never to tell her father, to spare his feelings. When targets decide to go no contact with their abusers, and we urge them not to because it's so cruel. Sadly, many individuals submit to these appeals. For others, who decline to erase themselves, there are plenty of voices ready to try and pile on the emotional blackmail. For people who've been trained to look after everyone else's welfare, sometimes to the total exclusion of their own, these kinds of emotional blackmail can feel extremely difficult and slippery to deal with, inviting targets to feel guilty and heartless if they don't comply. But none of these supposedly compassionate appeals stand up. And when we stand back for a minute and examine any of them, their manipulative power evaporates. Whether we're a target, a perpetrator, or a witness to emotional blackmail, we all have the capacity to reflect on our choices and distance ourselves from this abuse. Resisting emotional blackmail means becoming more discerning in our responses to distress, and learning that some appeals for personal comfort should not be indulged. Counterintuitively, this doesn't mean becoming less compassionate, but more compassionate. And it means recognizing the double-edged nature of emotion, which can be a valuable friend and a terrible enemy. Emotions play a vital role in navigating life. Part of that role is providing crucial shortcuts in the simple daily dilemmas we encounter. Individuals who've lost emotional response can become immobilized in a nightmare of information processing, generating endless rational arguments for different courses of action. Just choosing a shirt to wear could leave them overwhelmed. Emotion short-circuits this rumination. We choose what feels right. Social psychologist Robert Science challenged popular assumptions of his time that emotion only occurred after rational information processing had taken place. He noted research on preferences, attitudes, impression formation, and decision-making, suggesting that emotional judgments were often made independently of rational considerations, made faster than rational considerations, and made with greater confidence. Other researchers have supported these observations, including neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, who found that our emotional evaluations of situations and their outcomes play a central role in our decision-making. Unfortunately, the same simplistic nature of emotional processing that stops us agonizing over simple choices often leaves us open to manipulation from emotional appeals, which encourage us to make uninformed judgments on matters that need more serious consideration. We can end up buying things we don't want, doing unreasonable favors for people, condemning the innocent, getting preyed on by ideological groups in the midst of our grief, giving abusers that one last chance, again Simplistic emotional processing also leads us to place quite staggering burdens on others. When we tell our atheist son to keep going to church for his mother's sake, or command our daughter to hide her same-sex attraction from her father, or urge targets not to go no contact with their abusers, or try to silence accounts of religious abuse, we might genuinely believe we're doing something kind, even performing a humanitarian service. But it's just keyhole compassion, focusing on one party's possible distress and completely failing to process the experience of the other party. Let's widen the aperture and look at what we're really asking. Here we have individuals who've often had to cope with long-term manipulation, abuse and dogma, grappling with draining levels of shame, anxiety and neurosis. Many feel like imposters, unable to fully receive love from the people around them, disconnected from their lives by pretending to be what others expect them to be, just to survive. And now, just as they're beginning to move towards freedom, integrity, truth, and the restoration of psychological health, we're directing them to carry on sacrificing all of that, just so other people can keep some comforting illusions. Callous as it might seem to casually consign people to a lifetime of repression like this, it's not always driven by conscious, malicious intent. Often, it's pure laziness. As the law of less work observes, given the option, we tend to choose the courses of action that require the least effort. And not just physical effort. In a 2010 study by Cool and colleagues, participants showed a significant bias towards courses of action that demanded less thinking. Many studies like this show that where possible, humans often try to avoid effortful mental activity. Keyhole compassion is a hopelessly simplistic emotional response to potential conflict, trying to bypass the complexity of having to think, discuss, negotiate and resolve, and instead just pretend nothing's different. In fact, keyhole compassion often works against both parties. To see why, let's look at comfort zones. We could visualize our comfort zone as a circle containing all the activities, feelings and ideas we feel most at ease with. Outside that, we have a ring we could label growth. This is a less comfortable area we move into when we're stretched by new activities, feelings and ideas, learning new skills, working through difficult but manageable new problems. By trading some comfort for development, our central comfort zone expands. Outside this, we have another ring we could label overload. Here, the level of challenge starts to become unmanageable. We become depleted and begin to accumulate damage. To develop ourselves and expand our comfort zone, we want to be spending significant time in the growth ring. We also want to limit the time we spend in overload. At times of grief and distress, we might experience extended periods in overload, and it's important to recharge with healthy sources of comfort. When we try to make our daughter's sexuality a guilty secret kept from her father, we're directing her to spend significant time in overload, constantly topping up the shame, anxiety, and fear she yearns to recover from. But we're also preventing her father from moving out of comfort into growth. Millions of parents who are initially hostile when they find out their offspring don't conform to some hope or expectation do come around eventually and enjoy a closeness neither party would have imagined. A closeness based on truth, not an illusion of closeness based on pretense. If those parents had been kept in ignorance, they would never have got to experience that. Instinctive emotional thinking is great for quick fixes, not long-term solutions. Trying to apply simplistic emotional shortcuts to complex situations can leave us locked in pain and ignorance. Sometimes an entire group is destroyed in the process. Whenever Maeve or Rini fall out of lockstep with the personal plans and preferences of their mother, Norma, she loses it. Their offences might range from not being free for some family event, to revealing they didn't plan to have children, to cutting their hair short. On good days, Norma might descend into displays of wailing distress. On bad days, she escalates into full-blown screaming tantrums. Each time, Norma's codependent husband, Colin, tries to comfort her. For Colin, who spends most of his home life silently blending into the furniture, these incidents are just about the only time he springs into action. Often, after Norma eventually calms down, Colin scolds his daughters for upsetting her. Sometimes he tells them, "You've destroyed your mother." If Colin had stepped out of simplistic emotional reflex mode and into effortful reflective thinking, things could have turned out very differently. Recognizing the long-term damage his daughters faced without his intervention, he might have formulated strategies to defend them against Norma's abuse, found ways to support them when they stood up for themselves. He could have built strong relationships with them and cultivated a solidarity that elevated the whole family. Whether or not his marriage survived, he'd still have Maeve and Rini in his life. Instead, relying on endless emotional quick fixes, he focused exclusively on comforting Norma. He declined to defend his daughters and crushed their attempts to self-champion, which just seemed to antagonize Norma. He tried to train them to be invisible like him in the false hope of an easier life. In fact, things got much worse. By offering zero pushback, Colin reinforced Norma's belief that she could do anything without consequence. Eventually, Maeve and Rini will break all contact with their parents, leaving Colin to console the monster he helped to create. Colin will be mystified by their departure and will blame them for destroying the family. Norma is a squeaky wheel. The term comes from an old proverb. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, or, in the US, the grease. The message is that people who make the most noise often end up getting what they want. The squeaky wheel could be a parent, a child who gets indulged by parents and siblings, an employee in the workplace, an ideological group. In his attempts to comfort Norma, Colin was certainly trying to alleviate distress. The pivotal question is, whose distress? On the surface, it would seem to be about Norma's. In fact, it's all about Colin's, which is the root of this entire mess. The fact is, Colin's uncomfortable with difficult feelings. He's never learned to deal with them, to tolerate them, sit with them, reflect on what they're really about. Because of this, his knee-jerk emotional reflex is to shut them down. This real-life case illustrates the difference between compassion and enabling. Compassion supports and nurtures healthy development. It acknowledges the wider context of a situation and recognizes that comforting interventions sometimes have negative consequences, like obstructing learning and reducing motivation to change. By recognizing when to step in and when not to, compassion facilitates growth. In contrast, enabling indulges and excuses unhealthy behavior. It focuses on the superficial discomfort of the moment and ignores harmful potential knock-on effects. As a result, enabling facilitates impoverishment. By enabling Norma, Colin reinforced her dependence, regression, and fragility. The use of emotional blackmail also distinguishes compassion from its corrupted imitator. When targets of abuse go no contact with malignant abusers, some enablers try to shame them, claiming it's like going no contact with someone because they have cancer, punishing someone for being unwell. This analogy is classic emotional blackmail. It completely disregards the welfare of targets and adds insult to abuse by painting them as heartless caricatures. Let's bring the analogy into line with the reality of the abusive situation. Imagine that contact with the patient sets off an extreme allergic response in the visitor. Just a word, or even a look, could send the visitor's immune system into overdrive, producing a range of volatile symptoms. This is what abuse does. As a legacy of the endless attacks targets have endured, their psychological immune systems become hyper-responsive around the abuser. They've learned all the little phrases and gestures that signify a coming storm. In response to these stimuli, the target's defenses explode into overreaction. Unlearning these deeply conditioned responses can be a tough, lengthy process. Ongoing contact with abusers, which constantly reactivates these responses, can sabotage and unravel the target's recovery. Going no contact doesn't just offer a path to health for targets, but also for abusers. For some abusers, experiencing the authentic rejection that results from their abusive behavior motivates them to seek help. Protecting them from rejection removes that motivation. Compassion allows both parties to choose health. If abusers refuse it, their targets are no less free to choose health for themselves. In contrast, enabling blocks that choice for both parties. If we don't want to turn ourselves, or anyone else, into human chairs for the indulgence of others, we need to put our brains to work. We need to shift out of emotional quick-fix thinking and into effortful, reflective thinking. We need to become comfortable with some difficult feelings. In particular, we need to recognize that difficult feelings can often be a healthy and vital part of development, and that trying to shut them down can sabotage that development. Sometimes, that sabotage can span generations. Life is a struggle for every species on the planet. We're thrust into a survival situation in which we face danger, uncertainty, and lack of control. Humans use a huge range of coping mechanisms to get through these challenges. We use mood-altering substances and activities as a deflection: food, alcohol, drugs, sex, immersion in fictitious worlds from literature, cinema, and television. All fine in moderation. Not so fine if they become addictions or ways of avoiding impending crises. Another coping mechanism is magical thinking, proposing causal relationships between events, processes, and entities for which there's no demonstrable connection. Lindemann and Arnio described magical thinking as ontological confusions between the distinct processes of physics, biology, and psychology. We might believe inanimate objects have intentions, or that our thoughts have the power to create catastrophe. Research bears out what we might have suspected. Magical thinking peaks when we experience danger, uncertainty, and lack of control. When anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski studied the inhabitants of the Trobriand Islands off the east coast of New Guinea, he found an interesting disparity in their fishing practices. When they fished in the lagoon, they could use an easy, reliable method of poisoning that produced consistently large catches. In contrast, fishing in the open sea was hazardous, and there were huge variations in the size of their catches. Malinowski noted that with lagoon fishing, where the fishers could rely on knowledge and skill, there was no appeal to magic. But with the open sea fishing, where there was danger and uncertainty, magical rituals were extensively practiced to try and secure safety and results. When we feel a lack of personal control, we sometimes compensate by turning to external systems that seem to symbolize greater control. In a 2008 study, Kay and colleagues asked participants to rate the likelihood that some kind of god or non-human entity existed who controlled events in the universe. Prior to this question, some participants had been directed to remember times in their lives when they felt absolutely no personal control. Other participants were told to recall events in which they did feel personal control. Members from the no personal control group were much more inclined to endorse the existence of a controlling being. This ties into a vast field of research, showing how we change our magical ideas to meet the psychological needs of the moment. In times of overwhelming overload, magical thinking provides a comforting refuge for some people. In many cases, the mood-altering effect of focusing on a magical idea can help some individuals continue to function in the most intense part of a crisis, before coming back down to earth and gathering the strength to face reality at a manageable pace. The trouble arises when our use of magical thinking opens the door to harm, to others or ourselves. Like drink and drugs, everything depends on the variety you're using and the quantity you're taking. Wearing what you believe to be lucky underwear during an exam might well help you pass, not because the underwear has magical properties, but because your belief lowers your anxiety, boosts your confidence, and enhances your performance. But that belief becomes harmful if relying on your underwear leads you to neglect your studies, and the problems multiply when you start trying to involve other people. I grew up with someone who attributed a seemingly endless list of objects with magical significance. We were all expected to acquire detailed knowledge of her boundless magical thinking and cater to it. If we didn't, there were fireworks. One day, in my early teens, making hot drinks in the kitchen, I was startled by a blood-curdling scream behind me. She'd noticed a couple of crossed knives on the kitchen counter, which magically signified an argument. Ironically, her nerve-shredding outbursts often provoked the very outcome she magically anticipated. Sometimes things get more physical. Many years ago, when my brother opened his umbrella to dry indoors, a guest caused a huge scene, trying to wrestle it from him and close it, based on the magical notion that opening it would bring bad luck. I'm pleased to report that this tough twerp was swiftly subdued by my brother. But this is where the trouble starts, when the magical thinker's comfort impinges on the comfort of others. It's here that we come to a crossroads, with paths that can lead to antagonism or veer away from it. Many magical thinkers do veer away from it. Some choose to listen to people's valid objections and rethink their ideas. Others choose to maintain their magical coping mechanisms, but keep them confined to their own lives without imposing on others. Both of these roads offer the possibility of peaceful coexistence in which no one's comfort eclipses another's. But they also require some effortful reflection. And unfortunately, our lazy brains often accelerate us straight ahead into conflict. As Robert Zions noted, emotional judgments are often made with great confidence, without rational processing. He also noted that once those judgments are made, we often defend them with rationalizations. This might feel like rational processing, but its goal is very different. Rational processing looks for answers. Rationalization looks for justifications. It's another kind of keyhole thinking. We hunt for plausible-sounding arguments in favor of our emotional judgments, and stop when we find them, blocking out valid arguments against. When we try to force our magical coping mechanisms on others, it would be great if the pushback we receive prompted some reflection on our part. Instead, we often just build walls of fallacious rationalizations to justify our imposition. In our efforts to fend off critics, we misattribute them with imaginary malicious motives, allowing us to personally attack them without compunction. We might even claim their objections are a sign that they're under the thrall of magical beings, invalidating their autonomy. Convinced of the truth of our magical coping mechanism, we rationalize that it's okay to gag our critics by making the questioning of our magical thinking a social taboo. We rationalize the abuse of child indoctrination, forcing powerless, unsuspecting children to accept our illusions as indisputable truth. This abuse is passed down the generations. We rationalize that we're justified in punishing disbelief with a range of penalties up to and including state-sanctioned murder. Now, Children who never got the choice not to join never get the choice to leave. Each generation shackles the mind of the next in inescapable service to the magical coping mechanism of a long-dead ancestor. Not content with earthly punishments, we invent magical dangers. We torment our imaginations with new punishments of incomprehensible scale. Realms of perpetual torture where bodies are boiled, burned, and stripped of flesh, then restored, only to experience the same all over again, forever. We rationalize this psychopathic sadism by calling it justice. By inventing these realms, we create unrivaled nightmares, demanding unprecedented levels of comfort. Let's reflect on the bizarre corner we've just painted ourselves into. We now have to comfort ourselves against a magical danger that we dreamt up to comfort ourselves against real danger. Even if the real danger subsides, we're now stuck in a self-reinforcing danger-comfort cycle of our own making. Even superficially positive elements of a magical coping mechanism can create conflict. The promise of a members-only magical afterlife paradise motivates us to impose ourselves on others, especially loved ones, in the belief we're saving them. When our loved ones don't comply, we might blame them for our distress. If we stepped back from our rationalizations, we might realize we're the ones causing the distress. We're operating a one-way system, expecting to be heard, but declining to listen, expecting our needs to be met, but not giving a thought to anyone else's. These one-way systems tend to end one way, in pain and ignorance. Our freedom to cope in our own way with life's ordeals ends when our coping mechanisms become an added ordeal for other people to cope with. At that point, it's no longer just a source of comfort for the individual, but a source of oppression for the people around them. Then, it's time for pushback. So long as any group continues to rationalize behavior that obstructs and violates the liberties and entitlements of others, conflict remains inevitable, and no lazy emotional shortcuts will magic it away. Ex-theists who speak out against religious abuse have often gone through sustained periods of debilitating overload to finally break free of their indoctrination. In abusive religious groups, the gap between comfort and overload is wafer thin. Step outside the confines of the pre-designated comfort area and you're the enemy. It can be a grueling process, pushing through the wall of rationalizations they were often born behind, and building a space in between these extremes where growth feels manageable. And even after this, ex-theists from some of the more extreme groups face continuing overload when they share their stories, working to make an easier departure for others who are still trapped inside. For their efforts, they're relentlessly hounded, marginalized, and censored. In some countries, killed. The contrast between this genuine, risk-taking compassion and the artificial product used in emotional blackmail couldn't be clearer. Humans have found many ways of coping with life's challenges. A final one worth mentioning is, of course, rational, effortful thinking. With this strategy, we can directly address many of the ordeals in life that we fend off with mood-altering substances and magical thinking. We can reduce uncertainty through disciplined investigation. We can overcome complex dangers by methodically analyzing their nature and creating effective countermeasures. Mindful reflection can also help us come to terms with areas we can't control, to work through false hope and refocus our attention onto more productive areas. Effortful thinking helps us to change the things we can change and to accept the things we can't. Think what could happen if we used it just a little more often. Humans often rely on snap, instinctive, simplistic emotional judgments. That's fine if you're choosing a shirt, not if you're processing complex situations with significant consequences. Emotional blackmail urges us to take mental shortcuts that work against us. Notice when you're being directed to look with emotional eyes at just one part of the picture. Get into the habit of widening the aperture. Don't be rushed. Take your sweet time. Getting comfortable with difficult feelings helps us move away from enabling unhealthy behavior and towards compassion that encourages health and growth. If some people choose sickness and stagnation, we have no obligation to join them. Compassion involves thinking about others as well as ourselves, not instead of. Rationalizations might have the feel of rational processing, but their single-minded focus is justification, not investigation. Some emotional blackmailers are amenable to rational reflection. Others, in the grip of powerful rationalizations, might be beyond reasonable reach. Every attempt to restore clarity just gets clouded over. It's important not to get sidetracked into endless, unproductive exchanges. Thankfully, it only takes one rational party to end emotional blackmail. I'd like to end with some hypotheticals. How would you respond to the following situations? A religious leader justifies child indoctrination on the grounds that his group is entitled to ensure the survival of its beliefs. A mother tells her offspring they have to make allowances for their father. He hasn't got their emotional control. If you can identify the problems with these, you're already resisting emotional blackmail.